it's Professor Wilkie here. Welcome to the second video in our Ancient Greece series as part of my History 101 class at Brevard College. I hope you'll find this video to be useful, and as is going to be our pattern here, we're going to start off with two slides that are going to be a part of most all of the videos that we have here as part of this History 101 class. We're going to start off by talking about key terms and concepts to give us an introduction of where we are headed with this. So I've titled this video Finding the Good Life, and we're going to talk about, continue our conversation about ancient Greece and talk about where we left off in the last video, which was the Greek Dark Ages, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to talk about the idea of strife as a means of improvement, and ultimately get to a conversation in class about the good life and what that means, and we're going to interrogate that a little bit. So the key terms and concepts that I hope you will get out of this video lecture are the Greek Dark Age, the Cup of Nestor, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those will sound familiar to most of you. Polis, Delphi, Agon, or Agon, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and Miletus. And as we did last time, we are going to start with a thought that you may or may not accept, that I may or may not accept, that someone has advanced about this portion of history, and a couple of hard questions that lead us to our own hard questions that I hope you will implement and bring to class with you. So the thought for the day is this. It is an argument that was advanced by many in ancient Greece. Strife brings out the best in people. Strife brings out the best in people. Do you buy that? What do you think? You can probably hear the truck outside my window. You might be thinking about that. Just like the siren yesterday. Not going to edit it out. One of the consequences, right, of recording these videos in my office in MG, which is very decidedly not soundproof. Anyway, strife brings out the best in people. And my hard questions for the day, I hope you're going to come up with yours. Is a common culture necessary for a society to thrive? Is a common culture necessary for a society to thrive? And do you buy the argument that strife is useful? If so, is it also good? So in other words, do you buy the idea that strife is useful and that it brings out the best in people? And if so, is that a good thing? We're going to interrogate that a little bit, and we're going to revisit this this concept at the end of this presentation. So let's start with where we left off. We left off right around 800 BCE in the last video with the onset of what has become known as the Greek Dark Age. And it leads us to this idea that strife brings out the best in people, because what we're going to find over the course of this video is that the ancient Greeks emerged better after this time of strife. And so they came to the understanding that strife was in fact a good thing for society and led society to a position of betterment. So there's good strife and there's bad strife according to this ancient Greek philosophy. Bad strife is war and death. That's not what they're talking about here when they say that strife brings out the best in people. They're talking about good strife, a competition to be the best, and competition as being valuable. Competition as being valuable. Now that's going to sound really familiar to some of you, and we're going to interrogate that in class, and I'm going to ask you where you have heard that before and where you hear that in commonplace here in 2019 in the United States. So as I said, some people argue that this ethic, this work ethic, this idea that strife brings out the best in people, lifted Greece out of this phase called the First Dark Age. So the dates for the First Dark Age, I didn't put them on the slide here, but roughly 1200 to 800 BCE is what's known as the Greek Dark Age. And one of the reasons it's called this is because for generations, archaeologists were not able to find what they call, quote-unquote, hallmarks of civilization that date back to this period. We're going to interrogate that a little bit in class. So the palaces crumbled and the kings fell out of power, and yet the common people were still there carrying on Greek civilization. So one could easily make the argument that if common people were still carrying on the culture of Greece, Greece did not, in fact, actually fall or have a dark age. And so it leads us to question this idea that is so prevalent in the study of history, that if the quote-unquote great men are struggling and have fallen, does that automatically mean we are in a dark age? Well, what a lot of historians would argue is, in fact, it just means that the wealthy men, white men in this case, have fallen, but there's still a culture under there. And it's a bit condescending, if you think about it, to say that culture can only be carried on by the wealthy or the elites or the powerful. And so we're going to think about that as we work our way through this. So the fruits of the labor of common people at this time were, for one of the first times in certainly recent history at this point in Greece, enjoyed by those who earned them rather than distributed upward toward the elites. So in other words, the average worker was enjoying the fruits of his or her labor, his labor in particular at this time in Greece. But that's a societal shift, and it's very much, I'm not going to use that word because that word's going to come to mean something. I'm not even going to say what that word is. Maybe I'll say it in class. But it's an almost a universalization process. I don't want to say that either, right? But it's very much a time when common people are in vogue, I guess you could say. And so more people have a seat at the table, and more people are responsible for carrying on this Greek culture. And so the result is what's been come to be called as the cult of the individual. So it mattered what individuals did and what they said. So one of the places we are going to start talking about these changes in Greek culture, actually we're going to use an object to interpret this portion of Greek culture, the cup of Nestor that you see here on the screen now. So the story behind this is, and this is one of the ways we know that individuals at a lower level of society, and everyday individuals, if you were carrying on Greek culture at this point. So the cup of Nestor dates to about the 8th century BCE. Greek traders were near Italy, and the object that you see here, this cup, is a wine pot that had been taken from Turkey, and as I said, was found near Italy. So the story goes that 3 Greek traders were drinking and having a good time in what would have been the ancient Greek equivalent of a bar, and they decided that they would have a contest. And so each of them scribbled a line of poetry on this cup. So you can sort of see, let me see if I can, let me change color here. So see right there, there's 3 lines of poetry there. And so these 3 lines of verse tell us 3 important things. Number 1, they were seafaring people. Number 2, it was a new form of writing, and this is the earliest existing example of what would become ancient Greece, Koine Greek. And number 3, this was a poem of personal expression outside the authority structure. So I'll say that again. It was a poem of personal expression that existed outside the authority structure. So in the last video, one of the things we talked about was that writing was used, in particular, the two forms of text that they had at that time were used for bureaucracy, everyday things like lists of who contributed what to the gods, who owed what. It was a census list, it was a list of ingredients, a shopping list, etc. Things that were used to perpetuate the business of the government, of the bureaucracy. And what we see here is something completely different. This is more deeply personal and deeply cultural. So I mentioned that idea of a cult of the individual. This is a good example here because these men are personally expressing their own feelings through this writing. So even after the collapse, the so-called collapse, without the hierarchy, they were still Greek, and they were still maintaining quote-unquote civilization. And this cup of Nestor is a really good example here. And so one of the things that's important to note is that there still was not a coherent Greece just now, just a common language and a common set of stories. We're going to talk a little bit about why that might be important. So they had a common language, them being the Greek people. So think of it this way. Greece was not a coherent country, but there was a decidedly defined group of people called the Greeks, and they shared a common language and common stories. And they drew from stories that you may have been exposed to before. The Iliad and the Odyssey, and Hesiod's Birth of the Gods is another example. But everyone at the time, Greek men especially, would have known about the Iliad and the Odyssey because everyone in Greece had been told these stories. They were passed down in oral form until they were written down. So Homer, for example, wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey. But even before Homer wrote them down, they were long-standing in Greek tradition. And it's like I said, they were stories that all Greek people would have known, and they became key to Greek identity. And one of the things that this makes us think about is that Greek identity was tied to history and memory. So they thought of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Birth of the Gods story as ways that they formed their own identity through their history. And we're going to interrogate that concept of history and memory. As a matter of fact, I teach an entire course on history and memory where we go all through history. We actually start with the ancient Greeks and go all the way through the Holocaust and talk about the ways history and memory are used as tools in study of the past. But this leads us to questions about how the Greeks became Greece. In other words, how did a group of people with a shared language and a shared set of stories and a shared understanding of the past and a shared memory become Greece, the country? So if we think of Greece today, we can point to it on a map, right? So there's this process through which Greek people became Greece. And this really centers in the rise of city-states. And one of our key terms is polis, P-O-L-I-S. Also known as, let me see if I can type this in here, actually for you to see. So city-state is what you might know more so than polis. Polis is the Greek name, but it just means city-state, right? And so there were about 1,500 of these city-states in the Greek world by about the 8th century BCE. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, things you've heard of before. These were all city-states, and they became the way that the Greek people would become Greece. And so invariably there was a little bit of fighting between the city-states. We're going to talk about that a little bit as we progress. But another way that the Greek people became Greece was that they solidified their history and their memory and their shared stories into a religious system. So Delphi, for example, is a temple, and so often we would see Greek city-states sprout up around these temples. So this was the home of the Oracle of Delphi, where seers would predict the future, and it became an important part of Greek culture and a religious culture. And Delphi actually became the center of Greek religious life. And one of the more interesting things that we'll talk about a little bit is that in ancient Greece, often, especially in our modern culture within Christianity, we have this idea that humans were created in the image of God. And yet, at the same time, if you look back to Greece, the gods were in fact created in the image of man. If you look at icons or statues of the gods, they are in the form of men, and that becomes very clear. And so we see the cult of Delphi, for example, turn into what became as I said, the center of Greek religious life. And it was something that further entrenched Greek culture and sort of made the Greek people become Greece, as it were. So another thing that influenced the beginning of Greece, as it were, is something that's familiar to you, especially if you're an athlete maybe, is the Olympics. The first Olympics were in 776 BCE. I'm not big on memorizing names and dates, right? You know that about me by now, but I'm going to put this in here just so you can see it. 776 BCE was the date of the first Olympics, and it sort of began, or it was a manifestation of this Greek concept of agon, A-G-O-N. I'm going to write that for you too. A-G-O-N, agon, agony, agon. It depends on how you pronounce it, right? They would have pronounced it agon. It looks like agon. I'm going to say agon, right, because it sounds like agony, and that's how you're going to think of it. But Essentially, this concept of agon, is that nothing worthwhile comes easy. And this was entrenched, right, in the idea of the Olympics. And some mark 776 BCE at the first Olympic Games as the start of Greece. In other words, not the start of the Greek people, which we've been talking about at length, right? But the start of Greece as in a distinct place that is a national construct. And so as we see the Greek people sort of start to become Greece, one of the things that comes along with that is this concept of colonization. So the Greeks begin to colonize the Mediterranean. So they sent there's seafaring people, right? And that did not change even during what we call the Greek Dark Age. But a really good example of this colonization is in a city called Miletus, and you see some of the ruins here on the screen now. But I actually have a map of Miletus. It's in what is modern day Turkey, so you can see here. Let me see if I can get my. Okay, let me find a different color. So what we see here is this is the Mediterranean Sea right here, right? And I don't know if you can see it or not, but I'm going to roughly outline. There's a lighter green on this map. What you see here was actually land at the time in question. So Miletus right here, or sorry, what you see here was not land. It is land now. Let me back up. What's light green here is currently land, but it was not during late antiquity. Miletus was right on the ocean. But what happened was there was a river that flew, it was the Meander River. If you've ever heard the word meander, right, to sort of zig and zag, it comes from the Meander River. And so what happened was the Meander River had its outlet right here in Miletus on the map, and it starts to slowly but surely, right, fill in all of this right here with land, and all of a sudden Miletus is not on the sea. And Miletus was the most important, arguably, port in the Mediterranean. It was the wealthiest port in the Mediterranean, but what seems like a very straightforward process of sedimentation coming down a river, filling in a shallow part of the sea, and making it land, that all seems like a very straightforward process, right? But it causes a dramatic change in thought for the ancient Greeks. And here's why. You and I can think of this rationally, right? We can understand the process of sedimentation. Probably in middle school, you had a science class where you talked about the concept of sedimentation and the concept of rivers and seas. What class did you learn that in? Probably science, right? Science didn't exist at this particular time when Miletus was formed. But what happened was, so previously in Greek culture or Greek society, who was to blame when things happened? Good or bad? The gods, right? It's easy to blame it on the gods and say, well, it was the will of the gods, right, that this thing happened. And so if we were to look at Greek culture prior to this particular era, right, we would say it would be logical that the Greeks would blame the gods for what's happening here at Miletus, and yet they don't. So as the people in Miletus watch their harbor disappear, they see that the cause is sedimentation buildup, right, from the river that meets the sea, and they blame natural causes. They say, we can observe what's happening here, and it's just a matter of sedimentation and rocks coming down the river and filling up our harbor. So they don't blame the gods, they blame natural causes. And that's something that for us, right, in 2019, is a no-brainer. It is so self-evident that, of course we think that, right? But this, I cannot overstate what an important shift in thinking this is for the people of Miletus, for the Greek people. And essentially, this is a bold statement, but it makes them the world's first scientists. So they observe a phenomenon and seek to understand it based on natural causes rather than supernatural causes. And this changes the world. I cannot, as I said, overemphasize enough what a major shift in the world this turns out to be. And so This leads us to Thales of Miletus. He was arguably the world's first philosopher. He used geometry. He predicted solar eclipses. He was a scientist and a philosopher, of course. And he inspired Pythagoras. You've heard of the Pythagorean theorem? This is why I'm an historian and not a mathematician. The Pythagorean theorem, right? He was the first one, Pythagoras was, to say that numbers explained everything in the world. He was inspired by Thales of Miletus. And then Hippocrates was also inspired by this rise of science and philosophy in this coastal city of Miletus as people start to observe why things happen in the natural world. And so, it's funny, with these videos, I always think that I'm rushing through them and that they're very quick, but we're 20 minutes in at this point. So it's a good time to loop back to our original question, our original thought. Strife brings out the best in people. And the hard questions, is a common culture necessary for a society to thrive? And do you buy the argument that strife is useful? If so, is it also good? What do you think about that? Dramatic pause, right? Because I'm giving you time to think about that. So there we are. Thank you so much for listening in. I'm going to expect you to come to class with 2 hard questions of your own. So you see mine here. Don't steal mine. This is how I know if you listened all the way to the end of the video. Come to class with 2 just handwritten, written down hard questions based on things we talked about in the video. And we're going to have a discussion about these. And what this is going to do is it's going to set us up for our conversation. We've talked about how thought patterns shifted. We've talked about the rise of philosophy now, right? This is going to become very important. We're also going to talk about the way these shifts in thinking lead to different forms of government. And that's going to lead us right into our reacting to the past exercise. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you all in class.